1940. In the skies over Kent, RAF fighters take on and drive back wave after wave of German bombers. The dramatic defeat of the Luftwaffe ended at a stroke Hitler's plans for a full-scale invasion. But it marked the beginning of a longer and more ruthless battle for Britain. A desperate battle, fought over 22 million square miles of the Atlantic Ocean. Hitler would wage this war with his deadliest weapon yet, one that struck from beneath the waves, the U-boat. The aim was to cut Britain's vital supply line, to starve the country into submission. Britain's survival depended on the merchant navy and the warships protecting them.
The job was so very, very important in that the supplies of raw materials were coming in, even though there was only half of a convoy load that got to these shores. We had to have these this amount of stuff coming in all the time. Otherwise, the war would have been lost.
The purpose was not to sink warships. If that was possible, it was done. But the main aim, the main target was the merchant navy.
The battle against the submarine was one of the bitterest struggles of the war. Using the latest electronic technology and support from the air, it would take the Allied navies 3 long years of setbacks and near defeat to win back the Atlantic with this, the world's first truly modern anti-submarine warship. This is the story of how what started as the U-boats war ended up belonging to the submarine killer.
British problem after the fall of France was they only had one place to get supplies from, and that was North America in the short term. And they needed 55 million tons of imports per year. It all came by sea, and the main connection was from North America to Britain, 3,000 miles of the North Atlantic, and this was the obvious target for their U-boats. And that was their strategy, to try and cut the transatlantic lifeline, or at least to strangle it sufficiently to prevent the British from being able to carry on fighting.
At the heart of the Admiralty's defensive strategy were the convoys. Huge flotillas of merchant ships, often over 50 strong, sailing in close formation. They would be accompanied by a naval escort. The ideal ships for convoy protection work were destroyers and sloops. Both were fast and well armed, principally with depth charges, 250-pound drums of high explosive, which were set to detonate at the U-boat's estimated depth. But destroyers and sloops were in critically short supply, and the Admiralty was forced to rely on a makeshift warship, based on an old design.
In the last days of peace, they cast about for a suitable substitute escort, and they came up with a type of ship which is actually derived from a whaler, a corvette. And so these corvettes stood in for the missing higher performance escorts and did a magnificent job, which they were never designed to do, which is the usual story of improvisation in wartime.
Full speed ahead, bros. Full speed ahead, bros.
Life on board a corvette was pretty rugged. You have no idea how they rolled and pitched continuously. In the early corvettes, the decks were always awash. There was an open bridge. There was no shelter. Many men were frostbitten. There was no Arctic clothing like there is today. You had a duffel coat, and if it got wet, you might not be able to dry it for days. The men slept under the short forecastle, slung in hammocks, and very often were soaking before they got on watch. So life was fairly hard.
But worse than the misery of the Atlantic weather for the corvette crews was the feeling of impotence when facing the enemy.
You were a sitting duck, absolutely a sitting duck. In the case of one particular convoy, SC7, we joined that convoy incoming from Nova Scotia, and it was absolutely loaded, about 30 ships, and we ended up with only 16. The first notification we had that there was one in the vicinity, one or more, was that there'd be the sub-aqua sound of a torpedo striking the side of a merchant ship. Within seconds, the alarm bells would ring and would be closed up at action stations. You could safely say on many occasions that the U-boats were not port starboard or anywhere away from the convoy. They were in amongst the convoy. They'd be sinking them hand over fist, and you couldn't do a thing about it. If we did sight a U-boat, which was very, very rarely, we couldn't fire at it because we'd be hitting some of the merchant ships. So we were there to pick up survivors, basically. And we acknowledged that, especially in the corvettes. In the case of a tanker being torpedoed, the sea was one mass of flame. Instructions were always given to the crews of merchant packets to swim beneath the flame because there was an air pocket. Well, now, who in that state could think about those things at that time? So therefore, they were very badly burned in many cases. And you'd rub their arms and the skin it would just come off, you see. And they usually died very early. They were the ones who did die early.
For the British and the Germans, the fundamental problem was finding each other in the vastness of the Atlantic. Both sides used a primitive device called the hydrophone to listen for the enemy's propeller noise. But the hydrophone was useless against a U-boat already lying in wait, with its engines off.
What they really wanted was an active method of detecting submarines where you would actually search the ocean floor. And just at the very, very end of the First World War, they developed something called ASDIC, which worked by sending two beams down below the hull of the ship. And when you sent out the beams, you got a ping back, an echo, from a submerged object.
You would approach him and try to gauge what his speed was and what his depth might be. And then you would go straight for him at maximum speed. That was maximum speed for a corvette, which would be 16 knots. If you didn't do maximum speed, when you dropped your depth charges, you blew your stern off. So you made sure you did maximum speed. Well, you always lost contact within the last 200 yards. So the last 200 yards was guesswork. So it was crude.
ASDIC represented the Navy's first tentative step into a new world of electronic warfare, but it had serious limitations. Although it gave range and compass bearing, ASDIC couldn't determine the U-boat's depth. And since depth charges were only effective within 25 feet of the target, attacking a U-boat was still a hit-and-miss affair. But just occasionally, the corvettes would get the chance to turn the tables on their underwater enemy.
The sound of the ASDIC was terrifying. A ping hit your hull, and you could hear it throughout the boat. It had, one has to admit that, a disconcerting effect also on the crew, because underwater you are defenseless, you can't do a thing. The first thing to do was to install complete silence on the U-boat, and if possible, to go deeper. And there you sat and you heard the ASDIC, and they pinged at you, and they threw depth charges. And it was a simple question of who could stay longer, who had the better nerves. And the most experienced submarine commanders had the best nerves of the whole Navy.
Unlike modern submarines, U-boats were slow underwater and could only stay submerged for a maximum of 18 hours. It was on the surface that they were most deadly, and the surface was precisely where they could not be detected by ASDIC.
Wir waren ja in Suchstreifen aufgestellt und jetzt kam also ein Konvoi in in diesen Suchstreifen hinein. Ein Boot hat ihn festgestellt, sandte Peilzeichen, um die anderen Boote heranzuführen. Wenn man also den Geleitzug in Sicht bekam, dann war es muss man zunächst mal überlegen, ob man bei Tage angreifen wollte und konnte oder nicht.
The most vulnerable time for the convoy would normally be morning twilight or evening twilight. The U-boats would have got in position, and it is very hard to detect visually anything on the surface at that time.
Ich habe 80% meiner Angriffe über Wasser bei Nacht gefahren. Und auch dort gibt es verschiedene Möglichkeiten. Entweder man greift von der Seite an oder man lässt sich irgendwie in den Geleitzug hineinsacken und dann greift man mitten im Geleitzug an. Da gibt es verschiedene Möglichkeiten. Aber das Entscheidende ist doch, dass man ungesehen bleibt.
Between July and November 1940, U-boats sank 1.5 million tons of Allied shipping. U-boat crews called it their happy time. Like the Luftwaffe, the U-boat fleet was an elite force, and it too had its aces. They and their commander-in-chief, Karl Dönitz, were apparently succeeding where Goering and his air force had failed. Asdic alone was not enough to thwart the marauding U-boats. As well as ears, the escorts needed electronic eyes. The solution lay in the great British innovation that had worked so well in the Battle of Britain, radar. But using radar at sea proved extremely difficult.
The problem with radar is that the closer to the surface of the Earth or the sea that you wish to use it, the more precise it has to be. Primitive first radar sets of the kind used in the Battle of Britain were obviously pointed at the sky and could not really be used to look for objects on the surface of the sea, partly because the wavelength metric was very long, and that meant it was very imprecise, and partly because an object as small as the conning tower of a U-boat was invisible to primitive radar. So they had to wait for a second generation called centimetric radar, where the wavelength was reduced sufficiently, in fact to 10 centimeters, to be able to pick out an object of that size at a range of 7,000 yards. Now that was, of course, a tactical transformation of the first importance.
The fact that you could now locate a U-boat on the surface at night or in day, especially at night, unknown to him, gave you a totally new weapon on a total new dimension. For example, you might locate him 4 or 5 miles away. Later you could do better than that. But you knew where he was, and if you went straight for him, suddenly out of the darkness was coming an escort vessel to attack him, and he didn't quite know how this could be happening. And it made all the difference in the world, especially combined with the Aztec. If he dived, you knew where he had dived. The fact that you had located a foreign object unknown to him gave a totally new weapon. So you knew where he was, you could attack him immediately.
But just as Royal Navy tactics and technology were improving, the U-boat building program began to gather pace. Dönitz now had enough boats to begin using the wolf pack tactic, sending 15 or more U-boats against a single convoy. Even with Azdic and radar, the defenders found themselves overstretched. The Admiralty had to rely on deciphered German radio messages to try to steer convoys around the assembled wolf packs. Allied losses rose during 1941, but so did the number of U-boats sunk. The uneasy stalemate was broken by the entry into the war of the United States. But if the Allies thought this alone would mark a turn in their fortunes, they were in for a rude awakening.
One of the great ironies of the Second World War is that when America entered it, the short-term cost to the Allied cause, as it then became in full, was enormously high. There was America with this virtually infinite industrial muscle, huge reserves of manpower, enormous wealth, huge navy and all the rest of it. And you'd think, oh, well, problem solved. But not so. The Americans made a fundamental error at this point. They took the view that an inadequate escort was worse than none. So they took the trouble of assembling all these ships, and when they got into American waters, they were unprotected, and the U-boats couldn't believe their luck. And for 6 months from in the first half of 1942, effectively, the Germans had an Operation Drumbeat, as they call it, or Thunderclap, you can translate it either way, Paukenschlag, in which they had a second happy time.
Paukenschlag ist ein großes Wort. Und was verbirgt sich dahinter? Ich würde es zunächst mal nennen Hasenschießen. Das war also doch sehr einfach für uns, weil wir auf die Amerikaner stießen, die völlig untrainiert waren in der Sicherung ihrer Schiffe. Und deshalb waren die Erfolge zunächst mal verhältnismäßig groß und auch ohne Risiko.
By July 1942, the Americans were at last providing convoy escorts, thus ending the German second happy time. In the meantime, the Allies had made further advances in convoy protection. Along with ASDIC and radar, escort ships now had high-frequency direction-finding equipment, which could locate a U-boat from its radio transmissions as much as 50 miles away. And they had a new weapon, the Hedgehog. 24 mortars fired in a tight pattern. More precise than depth charges, they would explode on contact with a U-boat hull. The noose really started to tighten with the coordinated use of aircraft. Like the warships, they used radar, and in addition to bombs, depth charges. But the Allied aircraft had limited range, and Dönitz simply responded by funneling his U-boats into a 300-mile stretch of ocean known as the Greenland Air Gap. British sailors called it Torpedo Junction.
Even as late as March 43, we were losing merchant ships at the rate of 145 per month, which was significantly greater than the combined Allied forces were able to build and replacement. So we were losing the U-boat war. And there were voices in the Admiralty, was the effectiveness, questioning the effectiveness of the convoy system. Should it be discontinued? So they were all very worried, even until the end of March 43.
There was only one bomber with the effective range to provide full air cover for the convoys. That was the B-24 Liberator. The Allies knew they had to do whatever it took to close the air gap, and at the end of March 1943, they began diverting 200 Liberators from bombing raids over Germany to airfields in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland. The dreaded air gap was finally closed. The Allied navies now had the specialist electronics and the weapons they needed, and 3 years on, they at last had the right ship, the frigate. Frigates were as maneuverable and quick to build as a corvette, but with the ocean-going strength and offensive capacity of a destroyer.
The contrast between what a seasoned convoy sailor would have seen in 1939, 1940, and what was going on 3 or 4 years later must have been quite staggering, because originally you would have probably a couple of rusty destroyers and a corvette or two rolling around helplessly, almost, in bad weather, not really coordinated. You would watch your ships being decimated by determined U-boat captains, aces. And then in 1943 you would be surrounded by small purpose-built anti-submarine warfare frigates, equipped with radar, able to whistle up air support, sophisticated ASDIC operators working in pairs. The contrast was absolutely astounding. And by 1943 or so, you actually had your anti-submarine ship for the first time. And that was nearly half a century after the submarine was invented.
The 38 merchant ships of convoy SC-130 set sail for England on May the 11th, 1943, with a complete anti-submarine defence force around them. Although no one yet realised it, the turning point in the war against the U-boat had arrived. At the head of the escort ships was the destroyer HMS Duncan and her commander Peter Gretton, one of a new breed of determined anti-submarine specialists.
My father was a real professional, and that was in a world or at a time when the business he was in of anti-submarine warfare, and particularly convoy protection, was not very fashionable. People had done very little work on that between the wars. It was considered a secondary business to do. He tried to professionalize it, and I think succeeded, and certainly amongst his colleagues had a tremendous reputation for ruthless efficiency and professionalism. He used to leave the loudspeaker for the ASDIC on in his cabin when he was so-called meant to be sleeping and resting. And quite often he'd be the first person to hear that vital ping, that change of tone, which indicated the possibility of a submarine in the vicinity.
Dönitz deployed 21 U-boats in the path of the convoy. But Gretton's escorts now had the early warning systems, the experience and the armaments to keep the U-boats out of range of the merchant ships. The convoy was further reinforced on the 19th of May with another 5 warships which had sailed from Newfoundland. 2 frigates, HMS Jed and Sennen, made an immediate impact, sinking U-954 at the rear of the convoy. Dönitz's own son, Peter, was among those killed. The next kill was from the air. A Hudson bomber spotted a U-boat on the surface 10 miles away. From a height of 50 feet, the pilot scored a direct hit with 4 depth charges. U-273 sank without having fired a single torpedo. The following day, a Liberator from 120 Squadron found a U-boat on the surface and attacked.
This was the first time, in my opinion, that the aircraft cover was probably decisive. They spotted the wolf packs waiting. We knew exactly where they were. So you had a case of U-boats being sunk 50 to 100 miles ahead of us. Nothing came near the convoy.
Convoy SC-130 had passed through the U-boat killing grounds unharmed. Its safe arrival signalled victory in the Battle of the Atlantic.
One of the features of the SC-130 story is the way in which the escorts prevented the U-boats from getting a strike in against their charges, the merchant ships. And as an added bonus, they sank, or with the help of their friends in the aircraft, they sank 3 U-boats. So that is actually a triumph, to bring the entire convoy without a scratch on its paintwork right the way across the Atlantic, somewhat ahead of time, sinking 3 U-boats on the way. It's extraordinary contrast with what was happening in March.
In the month of May 1943, the Allies lost 34 merchant ships, but they sank 41 U-boats. They had destroyed 1/3 of the German operational fleet in a matter of weeks. Just as Goering had been forced to call off the Luftwaffe 3 years earlier, now Dönitz had to withdraw his U-boats.
Dönitz had reached a point where the combination of forces against him was now devastating and inescapable. No matter where the U-boats were, they would be met by a strong escort, an integrated escort, an extremely well-equipped escort on the surface, and on top of that there would be air patrols overhead, and on top of that these aircraft had teeth. They were now able to kill submarines very effectively with a combination of radar and depth charges.
Now it was the Allies' turn to celebrate, and with victory in the Atlantic, attention could be turned towards Europe.
The culmination of the war was D-Day in June 1944, but the build-up to that was at least 18 months. Just imagine, millions of tons of munitions, Canadian army as well as the American army, all piling into the south of England, ready for the invasion. Now, if U-boats had been able to strike effectively at that lifeline, which was now a great fat artery compared with what it had been before, the results would have been horrendous. They had to solve the problem of the U-boat, and what's more, they had to have at least a year clear run to build up their supplies for Normandy, and that's what the victory in spring 1943 actually meant. It meant that victory became possible.
Tomorrow, Decisive Weapons continues with the Springfield rifle. This fast and accurate firearm made its definitive mark at Gettysburg in July 1863. Decisive Weapons, 7 o'clock tomorrow.